fourth and final in our autumn series of talks related to the Leaves project. We'll get going with the talk in just a couple of minutes after my preamble, which is just to introduce myself. I'm Diana. I'm the Education Officer at the Minster and working also on the Leaves project. And from Northern Ireland, we have Aoife, whose name you probably know. She's recording and letting people in and doing the tech behind it today. So hello from both of us. So we're going to keep you all on mute so that you can hear, and we'll keep you on mute for the duration of the talk so that we minimise feedback. You might want to also turn off your camera because we're recording the session, as you've probably already seen, so that we can share the talk with other people who weren't able to attend this afternoon. So do let people know about it. It should be a fascinating talk. Victoria's been researching this for a long time, so she's very much looking forward to sharing her research with you. We've also got any of our past talks are also recorded, so do ask Aoife if you missed any of them, and she'll be delighted to share the links with you. The talk we expect to last about 45 minutes to an hour, and we'll allow time for questions at the end. We normally finish at around 3. In order to ask questions, you can either put your questions in the chat, so we will be monitoring that throughout, or please feel free to share your comments throughout as well. You can also put your hand up to ask a question by using the reactions button at the bottom. I'm just going to raise my hand so you can see there's a little hand icon in the corner, and that clearly shows me that you'd like to ask a question. Although occasionally people press it by accident, but that's okay as well. As you probably are aware, these talks are part of the Leaves of Southwell Project, which was to conserve the historic chapter house, which you're going to hear a little bit more about in a moment. We also re-roofed the high choir, which was the bulk of the grant that was given to us by the Heritage Fund, and through many, many other donors as well, including the Cathedral Friends. But very excitingly, it also went to develop further our beautiful palace gardens. And if you made donations today for the talks or at any point during the series, all donations from these talks go directly into supporting the work that's happening in the garden. And I just wanted to share that with you because very excitingly, this very week as we speak, our beautiful structure is being put up in the gardens, or we're going to call it the Octagon, which is a space with a shelter for people to sit and enjoy being in the gardens. And Aoife and I got a sneak preview at the end of last week, and it really is absolutely beautiful. So we're very excited about that. So your donations will support the new plants and possibly some more benches and furniture to make it a beautiful space for the community. I think I've said all I need to say. So I'm going to introduce Victoria. Victoria is our Honorary Librarian of the Historic Chapter Library. I like to call her the Historic Librarian, but I don't think she's very keen on that because of the implications about her age. Victoria has always had a passion for history, which was first noted as a preschooler, and she was happy to go anywhere as long as there was a castle for her to explore. She moved to Southwell 9 years ago, and she's proud to be the Honorary Librarian. She's also a Minster Guide of the Palace and the Minster. She's also an education volunteer. A place would probably fall down without her. And she's currently involved in research on several aspects of history connected to the Minster. Victoria's a great friend and supporter to us in the education team and to the Minster generally. So it's a real pleasure to introduce her and hand over to her now. You will hear from me a little bit later on.
Is it working now?
We ought to say she's also called Christopher Brooke this afternoon. In case anybody was wondering why she's called Christopher, I think Chris is there helping with Victoria's tech. There he is.
Yeah, he's a vital part of my speech because without him, we wouldn't have had any pictures. Without my son and his fiance, we wouldn't have had any text because I couldn't get the computer to work earlier. However, thank you very much, Diana. Right, can we start with the slide? Okay. Hopefully. England, 1300. The countryside was adorned with buildings of the church, from the great Cistercian abbeys of Rievaulx and Fountains to the smaller foundations such as chapels of ease for the elderly and infirm to worship in, rather than to make a sometimes arduous journey to their parish church. In Nottinghamshire, as we can see on this map, hopefully, as we can see on this map, there are monastic foundations such as the Priories of Blythe, Felly, Shelford, Worksop, Lenton, Mattersey, and of course Thurgerton, just half a mile away. The abbeys, Welbeck and Rufford, the Preceptory of the Knights Hospitaller at Ossington, and the Friaries of the Franciscans and Carmelites in Nottingham. And there were also two nunneries, Wallingwell Abbey and Broadholme Priory. So you can see the area covered is all north of the Trent, except for Shelford Priory for some reason. And those of you who know your geography might think Broadholme Priory is in Lincolnshire. It was until the boundaries, it was in Nottinghamshire until the boundaries changed. Many churches, parish churches, and the large secular churches of St Mary's in Nottingham, possibly St Mary's in Newark, but the mother church of Nottinghamshire, in Professor Hamill Thompson's words, the greatest of the collegiate foundations of England, was St Mary's of Southwell. This is Blythe Priory as it stands today, but in 1300, see, it would have had extensive monastic buildings and a larger choir, and right down to Sukhome Chapel, which was a chapel of ease to Warsaw, St Peter and St Paul. And then, of course, you might recognise this building. We have been fortunate to have heard some very interesting talks on the chapter house itself in the Leaves series, but what was the Minster like and the chapter of the time? What did they do in it? Basically, it was very like the Minster of today. But I think we lost a slide. You would go in through the new west door, which was circa 1300. Those of us who heard Professor Dixon's talk 2 weeks ago heard him say that there might have been windows in the west front, similar to these, which is Jumièges at Normandy, and Caen, St Etienne, which is also the burial place of William the Conqueror. So we go through the doors that we're all very familiar with into the nave. All the windows would have been semicircular. Only one window on the ground level is original, and that is on the north aisle closest to the northwest tower. Why that escaped modernisation is a mystery. And with only candlelight, the nave must have been quite dark, even on bright days. The remaining Normanesque windows were put in during the 19th century, the Great West window, mid-15th, and the Gothic aisle windows of 14th century. Now, also in the nave, just about here, we would have seen the parish altar of St Vincent. Because of course, this was a Roman Catholic church, the congregation were not allowed past the screens into the choir where the more serious part of the services took place. And there were also several chantry chapels in the nave. The glorious pulpitum that we see today is, of course, 14th century, but prior to this, there would have been one of stone or wood, and there do seem to be indications that it would have been of stone. The pulpitum was used as a liturgical space, sometimes being sung upon or the gospel read from it. The Pilgrims Chapel was added in the years between the building of the choir and the chapter house. And the room above, now the historic library, was used for storing documents, the minster's treasures and relics. Relics were and still are an important feature of the Roman Catholic Church. What the relics were at Southwell is unknown, but we know of 3 instances where penitential pilgrimages were made to the relics at Southwell. And there is an interesting interlude written in about 1520 by John Haywood, in which 4 men are bragging to each other. One, a palmer, that is a pilgrim, talks of the many shrines that he has visited, including Jerusalem, Venice, and Our Lady of Southwell. The choir at this time would have been about 50 years old, and the minster would have been painted, and in particular the chapels, several of which still show evidence of paint. Now, I don't know if you've all seen this. This is in St. Oswald's Chapel, and it's the remains of a flower. We have an illustration here from Lakenheath in Suffolk of a medieval wall painting. It is quite possible that the minster was adorned with paintings such as this. Now, I'd like to go back and look at chantries in a bit more detail. By 1300, there are at least 7 chantries in the minster. Chantries could range from simple, with mass said for the souls of the dead, for a set time or until the money from the patron ran out, or they could be perpetual, whereby the founder had given the minster an endowment, usually rents or land. These ended at the Reformation. Now you can see the medieval chantry chapels were here, 2 in the Pilgrims Chapel, 1 here and 1 here. For reasons we don't know, most of them were on the north side of the minster. This was taken from Josh Hall, so any of you who were stewards will hopefully recognise this from your steward's notes. One of the endowments given was an advowson for the Church of Barnborough, and this proved to be very lucrative as the land included coal, and Barnborough became one of the richest gifts in the chapter. There we are, that's Barnborough today. In 1291, it was worth £12 in the taxation of Pope Nicholas IV. Now, when you consider 2 of our prebendaries were only worth £6 or £7, that makes it a very valuable asset indeed. Right. The chantry question was the Lexington Chantry, founded by Robert de Lexington or Laxton. Robert was of a nationally prominent family, the members of which numbered amongst them the Bishop of Lincoln, the head of the Cistercian order, a steward of Henry III's household, and Robert himself, Prebendary of Norrell Overhaul, was prominently involved in both chapter and prebendal affairs, although this had at times to be second to his career in the royal service, which culminated in his being senior justice of the Common Bench, that is, the court for cases that did not directly involve the king. Now, Robert made provision for a chantry in the minster, which would be served by 2 priests, 2 deacons, 2 subdeacons, in honour of St. Thomas the Martyr, otherwise known as Thomas Becket. He made endowments that would maintain the chaplains, deacons, subdeacons, and also provide £27 of wax for a candle to burn at all masses, and £13 of wax for 2 candles to burn continually on the Feast of the Passion, and on the translation of St. Thomas the Martyr. Now, this document here is a copy of his instructions for the Chantry Chapel. And they would go, forever at the altar of the Blessed Thomas the Martyr in the Church of Southwell, for the souls of good memory of King John, Brian de Insula, the father, mother, brother, sisters, and all the relations and benefactors of Sir Robert de Lexington, Canon of Southwell, and for all the faithful souls alive and dead, shall daily celebrate the divine offices, following the choir of Southwell, as well as the vicars do, and saying daily placebo, dirige, and commendation for the said departed, before the said altar, together with the chaplain, who by the assignment of the said Robert de Lexington ministers there. The St. Nicholas Chantry, which is in the what we now call the Pilgrims Chapel, was founded by a seneschal of the Archbishop of York, a chap called Sir William Widdington. And he has in its foundation deed, here we go, sorry, this is St. Thomas's Chapel, of course, where there were 2 altars from de Lexington for chantry purposes. And this is what it would have looked like before Christian took out this arch. So when you go in now, there's no arch and the floor is level. But you can also see there's tombs here too, and one just there. William Widdington in his Chantry Foundation deed said that the chaplain shall daily celebrate divine service for his soul and for the souls of others above written, sometimes singing, sometimes intoning, according as the Lord shall inspire him, to the greater excitement of the devotion of those hearing him. Now, this isn't as subtle as you will have noticed, but it's an indication of a double chapel with the Mass being said and the decoration around it. Unfortunately, little remains of the chantries that once adorned the minster. The 3 main ones being St. Thomas's Chapel and the Pilgrims Chapel. Well, this naturally brings us on to tombs, and the minster is particularly bereft of medieval tombs. We have cross-slab tombs, but no knowledge of whom they represent. So this is a somewhat later one. There's very little evidence of this one, but you can see from the simplicity of the design on it that this one's quite an early one, as is this one. This one is definitely for a priest, because you can see he has a chalice on it. These could be laymen. Now, you all probably know this chap, the headless figure in the south aisle of the choir. But this is what it would have appeared like in 100 plus his head. And that is what it would look like in situ. It appears to be a 13th century cleric, so it most probably was one of the Prebendaries. There is also the effigy of a knight, now mostly lost, although we do have a section of his leg upstairs. And also in the choir during the early 14th century, the tomb of Archbishop Thomas de Corbridge was placed. A canon has the right to sit in the choir and chaplain, and by this time was most likely a priest. This is Tintern Abbey with a chapter in session. Again, not quite like our chapter house, but the general idea, you can see how it would work. A prebend was usually derived from a parish church and its property, thus providing a living for a high-ranking churchman, usually a canon at the foundation, either at a secular cathedral or a collegiate church. Collegiate churches were secular. Their brethren, unlike their monastic counterparts, served in the community, and St. Mary of Southwell was the mother church of Nottingham, a type of sub-cathedral. The Pentecostal procession and parish offerings were made to the minster at the North Porch rather than at York, and the chrism oil was distributed from here. Medieval church life ran around a mandatory 8 services a day. The minster would have matins, laud, prime, terce, septs, nons, vesper, and compline, in addition to which one or more masses would be said each day, and the services in the chantry. Solemn or high mass would be celebrated as grandly as possible, the celebrant assisted by 2 or more priests and others in minor orders. Many candles would be used, rich decoration of the altar, incense and plain chant. On Sundays and feast days, even higher pomp was in order. The larger and more important the church, the more magnificent the ceremony. For cathedrals and important collegiate churches, it should be of the finest. So 8 services a day, with the prebendal church needing services too. The prebendal villages were scattered far and wide, as you can see here. Well, we've got Southwell here, Halorton, which is the closest, Norrell, which is about 10 miles away, but way away at 32.5 miles away is Beckingham. So, oops, jumping ahead of the game there. Right, obviously it was impossible to be at both places at the same time, so the prebendary employed perpetual vicars to serve the needs of the parish and vicars choral to represent them in the minster. The position of prebendary to a minster like Southwell was highly sought after, for the prestige and rewards could be high. The Prebendaries of Southwell enjoyed many ancient privileges that made them lords of their own domain. Their jurisdiction included the proving of wills and probate, and the civil jurisdiction of assize of bread and ale, with authority over weights and measures, the power to punish fraud. Prebendaries held the rights over their endowments, and their tenants could and did appeal to the chapter court. The lands of the prebendaries were free of the authority of the sheriff and all other offices of the king, unless the consent of the canon had been given. The canons had in their houses and lands right of sock and sack, toll and theme, and the wonderfully infanganthef, the right of executing a thief, although we don't actually have any evidence that they did that. And in toll and utoll, and all the same customs of the honour and liberty which the king had in his own lands. Their tenants were almost, if not entirely, exempt from military service. Of course, being a member of the church did not necessarily make a benign manorial lord. I think it was the Bishop of Durham, in a time of famine, tried to, in a deal, fob his people off who were starving with a barn full of diseased grain. Fortunately, we don't actually have any instances of our prebendaries acting in such a despicable fashion. The prebendaries policed themselves and their clergy and the lesser people of the minster. The archbishops could theoretically only hold visitations and make recommendations, although this did not stop them from issuing orders. The chapter would then vote on their recommendations. The nature of absentee prebends and the forcefulness of the archbishops probably accounts for the success some of the prelates had in enforcement. It has been noted that the only time the chapter of Southwell seemed to show any energetic enthusiasm was in protecting their ancient freedoms. Southwell never had a head of chapter, and it appears that this position would go to the senior canon in residence and be held in rotation. Now, prebendaries could be nominated by the Pope, the Archbishop of York, and the King, Queen, and Prince of Wales. Many officials, both ecclesiastical and secular, were churchmen, and awarding them a prebend was a cheap way of giving them a reward. Thus, many prebendaries of Southwell, placed by the Pope, never even set foot in England, let alone Southwell. Top officials of the Archbishop and King were similarly rewarded this way. I came across a Spanish colloquial definition of prebendary: a lot of reward for little effort, or nice work if you can get it. Unseemly quarrels could take place, and there is a letter from Pope Nicholas, here he is, to King Edward I, he is here, asking Edward to liberate his representative from the Tower of London, where he had been placed following a disagreement between the Pope and the King over whom should be given a prebend of Southwell. The chapter favoured the King's nominee, and the Pope ordered that his candidate should be inducted under pain of excommunication and interdict. If this was not carried out, the Archdeacon of Nottingham in person and the chapter of Southwell by proxy were to present themselves before the Pope within 2 months. Strange to say, the Pope's candidate was inducted. This was not unusual, as the kings, archbishops and popes all believed they had the right to appoint to certain prebends. Nor was excommunication uncommon. It was a useful tool, and so was its reversal. By the time the building of the chapter house was underway, the minster had its final complement of 16 prebends. The Prebendaries had a vicar choral each who deputised for them in the minster, but we have no idea of how they were chosen or of communication between them and their masters. In addition, there were also chantry priests, some of who were vicars choral, deacons, subdeacons, the headmaster of the grammar school, choristers, as well as lay people working for the minster. Much of the evidence that we have of the minster is from the Liebes Alba, or the rather imaginatively named White Book of Southwell, so called after its cover. This book was started around 1347 and contains copies of documents in respect of properties, privileges, papal and royal statutes, and other matters pertaining to the minster. It was found prudent to have copies, as sometimes they were needed to show proof of legal ownership, and the archival system was chaotic. Unfortunately, once the original document had been safely copied, the original tended to be destroyed. The last time this book was used in evidence in court was in the 1830s. Not all documents are in it. Some were lost before copying began, and some were not entered at all. And this is the seal, the impression of the seal of the chapter of Southwell. This dates from about 100 years before the chapter house was built, so it's around 1200. But we know the seal was the same because the matrix used for it was, I think, the second longest in existence in England. It was in use for about 400 years, and it was only destroyed in 1588 because fraudulent documents had been produced using it. And you can see, it's not terribly clear now, but there's the Virgin and Christ child sitting on her knee. The Virgin possibly having her hand in benediction, but it's not totally clear. And around the outside, there's a cross, and it's a Sigillum Sancta Maria de Suella, an early pronunciation of Southwell, I think, rather than Southwell, as some people would have. Right, the White Book. These are the statutes of the Archbishops Corbridge and Romaine. Romaine, you will know as the Archbishop who was responsible for the beginning of the chapter house. Corbridge was the Archbishop from about 1300 to 1304. Now, I did mention earlier ideals of worship, but alas, all were not lived up to, especially, it has to be said, the singing. This is a copy of Archbishop John Romaine's statutes, and amongst the things he brings out for attention of the chapter is vicar and clerks are not to laugh and talk in choir on pain of expulsion for repeated offence. The sacrist is to sleep in the church and to ring the bells at the proper hours. Women, unsuspect relations excepted, are to be removed from the vicar's houses. Music books are to be made concordant, and houses of alien canons to be repaired within a year on pain of heavy fine for fabric of a new chapter house. Now, this was quite cunning because the rents were taken at source and brought to Southwell and then distributed. So the foreign prelates could not actually get their hands on their money unless they started to put their house into good repair. The canons were to pay their vicars £3 a year regularly, and perpetual vicars were to be established in all prebendal churches before the next visitation. And this is one I like. The successive residentiaries are not to give contradictory orders. Now, the canons retaliated about this, grumbling that the archbishop could not tell them what to do. Now, it's been suggested that the small head that faces into the chapter house is that of Archbishop Romain. And I just wonder whether it was the canons getting their own back. It's a very small head compared to all the other heads. And as if to say, well, you can look and think you can tell us what to do, but actually you're staying out there. And obviously these documents were not necessarily in date order because this is the next set of statutes, and this is from Archbishop Thomas Corbridge. And he wanted canons to provide by special statute against neglect of the services, and that at least 2 canons were always to be resident. And no order made by a canon in residence may be revoked by a successor unless it be plainly wrong, and then only by general chapter. And in the absence of all the canons, the rule of the church to be entrusted to some discreet person under oath. Stipends to the vicar's choral to be more punctually paid so that they may not roam about the country creating disturbances as before, to the scandal of all good people. And again, perpetual vicars to be instituted in all prebendal churches within a year. And he stipulated that these statutes were to be read after the martyrology in the chapter house once a month. Of course, the prebendaries tended to give them each other a rap over the knuckles and say, don't do that again. Corbridge was concerned over the number of prebendaries present. Romain only visited Southwell twice, and both times stayed at Thurgerton Priory, but Corbridge was very fond of Southwell and stayed in his palace and probably had more knowledge of the workings of the minster. Indeed, much to his shock and dismay, 2 vicars choral had to be separated from fighting in the churchyard in his presence. Had blood been shed, he would have had to reconsecrate the grounds. Who were these prebendaries? We know that some were active from their mentions of witnesses or protagonists in the White Book. The prebendary of Normanton, Henry Skipton, was always Archdeacon of Nottingham and was very active in the affairs of the Minster. And it was he who was summoned to the presence of the Pope over the non-appointment of the Pope's nominee. As Archdeacon, he was the Archbishop of York's representative and could stand in his stead for doing things like consecrations. Right, this is the prebendal house at Hollowton, part of which was around by 1300. And Nicholas de Neville was prebendary there, and he was accused of usury, that is, lending money for profit, and murder. Unfortunately, there's no more mention of either of these, though who he was to have murdered, whether he did it and whether he got away with it, we have no idea, just a little teaser. And then Thomas St. Albino was the vicar of Misterton and also a prebend of Dunham. Now, he was a bit of a bad lad. In 1328, Master Thomas of St Albans, still rector of Misterton, purged himself to Archbishop Melton following an accusation of repeated incontinence involving Isabella, daughter of Walter Bedelis of Misterton. However, it would seem that the accusations were not without foundation, as 2 years later, the Archbishop condemned him, finding him 100 marks and requiring his mistress Alice Bedelis, it is unclear if this was the same person or a different daughter, to leave under pain of deprivation of his benefice. As well as being the rector of Misterton, Thomas was also a canon and holder of Dunham, and clearly he had a lot to lose. Put my pages back in order. Right, Henry of Newark, Prebendary of North Muscombe, one of the absentee vicars. He was the Dean of York. He came to prominence in the service of Edward I as a trusted royal emissary to the papal curia, Scotland, France and Flanders. And on the death of Archbishop Romain, he was unanimously elected to the archbishopric by his fellow canons. He died 3 years after his elevation, but he was an active administrator, although he was, as I said, an absentee prebend here. Now, William Demelton and John de Roxford both became prebendaries in 1304, and neither seem to have been active in Minster affairs. Both were royal high flyers and senior officials of the wardrobe, Melton for the Prince of Wales and Roxford for the King. He also at times was the Treasurer of England. The wardrobe at this time controlled most of the royal finances, including that for war. Both were highly trusted by Edwards I and II and held several high offices from them. Edward's war against the Scots meant that the court spent a lot of time in the north during the 1290s. Roxford's friend and deputy was taken by the Scots, and despite offering a substantial ransom, he was brutally killed, and according to a chronicle, his skin was fashioned into a purse. Taking advantage of the king's absence from London, a gang robbed the royal treasury, which at this time was kept in the crypt of the chapter house of Westminster. Westminster Abbey. Edward, unsurprisingly, was incandescent and sent Roxford, a man of many talents, to investigate, which he did successfully. And readers of historic detective stories may recognise him as Hugh Corbett, the protagonist of a series of books by Paul Doherty. Some 17 years later, William Melton, now Archbishop of York, led a ragtag army against the Scots in order to give Queen Isabella, wife of Edward II, a chance to escape to Nottingham and safety. So perhaps not quite high reward for little effort. Both were pluralists, that is, they held several benefices at the same time. Roxford had an incredible 16 and was given a papal dispensation for them, as he was not yet a priest. Presumably a year or so later, when he became Bishop of Bath and Wells, he had been ordained priest. Now, Archbishop Melton, depicted in a stained glass, which is now at High Melton in West Yorkshire, but once adorned York Minster. Why he was demoted, we're not quite sure. And this is John de Roxford's tomb in Wells Cathedral. He also, it is said, has a carved head in the choir. Can't say they look altogether alike, but portraiture at this time was not true to likeness. Statues and heads were carved of someone who would look like a king or an archbishop or a bishop or a monk. They were probably true to life, that they just used somebody to use as a model. In fact, anybody who heard Paul Ellis's talk, when he mentioned he had to do the head of a bishop in Lincoln, and he looked around for drawings of the bishop of the time, it was a medieval bishop, and his friend said, "Oh, it looks like Brian Clough." And therefore, Brian Clough now wears a mitre and is in Lincoln Cathedral. Now, the prior of Thurgerton had a seat of importance in the choir, and possibly also in chapter. Why? No one is sure. It is possible that he and his fellow priors had been placed there as an impartial observer or advisor, and it would have put more than one prebendary's nose out of joint, as the prior's rank would have given them precedence over most of the canons. And of course, precedence in those days was quite important and jealously guarded. Indeed, the prior's seat is in the choir, next but one to the archbishop. Archbishop Thomas Corbridge had a special affection for Southwell. He spent the first Christmas of his archbishopric here and was buried here. His tomb, showed here, was placed in the middle of the choir. Dr. Trevor Folds described it thus: a plain table tomb on a moulded plinth with a splendid brass memorial, with Corbridge in full pontificals, mitred with a cross protruding above his left shoulder and a hand above his right shoulder, presumably his right hand in blessing. The figure was placed beneath a canopy, above which was perhaps an angel with wings extended, as if in protection of the soul. A fillet border along the four sides, which would have contained an appropriate inscription and identification of the occupant of the tomb. There was a story that when being berated by Edward I, the Archbishop died. Now, Edward was by now an old man, and his temper tantrums had increased in violence. But Corbridge was used to the king, and the king was angry because once again he and the Pope had wanted to present different men to a prebendary, this time one of York. The Archbishop backed the Pope, and although not a particularly confrontational man, he was quite capable of standing his ground for his archdiocese. And perhaps he remembered what had happened when an Archbishop of Canterbury had fallen foul of Edward's great-grandfather, Henry II, or perhaps Corbridge was ill. Now this is a king, and this is Henry II, arguing with an archbishop, usually taken to be St. Thomas the Martyr. Corbridge's tomb became a quasi-shrine, and a pyx, that's an offertory box, was placed there. Maybe the hint of martyrdom made him a sort of unofficial saint, or maybe he had qualities that had been lost in the course of time. The England of Kings Edward I and II was harsh, and Edward I war raged with the suppression of the Welsh and the attempted suppression of Scotland. Edward had himself been on crusade when younger and must have felt bitterly the defeat at Acre in 1291 when the Crusaders abandoned the Holy Land. People were dependent for existence on the weather, and in 1315, years of bad harvest, rain, and extreme cold led to the death of 10% of the population. For the rich, of course, there was heating, food, and enjoyment, music, literature, and hunting. But for the poor, there was just hard work and destitution. Medicine in 1300 was basic. For the poor, if they were lucky, They would know of someone wise in the way of herbs. If you were rich, the remedy was as likely to do you as much harm as the illness or injury. And here we have a physician making a diagnosis by looking at his patient's urine. This was common practice. Expensive medicines could be, and Edward I, in his final illness, had a bill of £134 for drugs that included water from roses of Damascus and rose sugar, along with gold, silver, and pearls. To put this into context, the wage of an unskilled labourer was £2 per annum. And these from the Historic Chapter Library are 2 silver pennies from the reign of Edward I. There was limited painkillers and no penicillin. Bloodletting was considered a necessity. Surgery was primitive, but archaeological finds have shown skulls that have knitted together, showing that perhaps in some cases it worked. Death, of course, was ever present, and the morality story of the 3 dead and 3 live kings was hugely popular, appearing in paintings, sculpture, and manuscripts. 3 kings were hunting in a forest when they encountered 3 dead kings who say to them, "As you are now, we once were. As we are now, you will be." A stark reminder to amend one's ways. Now, this is a dead king. He's made of lead and he is somewhat squashed, but he belongs in the Historic Chapter Library and was possibly used in processions or in mystery plays. And hunting, of course, was an ever popular pastime. And although the noble beasts of the forest were kept for the king to hunt, the Prebendaries had the right to hunt and hawk smaller game on their land, which brings us back to the chapter house. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Victoria. We often talk about the prebends and the prebendaries, but that was a wonderful way of demystifying it. And I loved your anecdotal talk. It was wonderful with all the detail. Particularly enjoyed the idea of Brian Clough being disguised as a bishop, or was it an archbishop in Lincoln Cathedral?
A bishop.
Bishop, yes. Wonderful. And if you do get down to the chapter house, Victoria referred to them, the faces are incredible. There's kings and bishops and creatures of every variety you could possibly imagine. So I'd like just to open up for people to ask questions of Victoria for the next few minutes. As I said before, if you use the reactions button at the bottom, there's a raise your hand icon, which you can do like that. Or please put your questions in the chat. Was something in the chat? That was fascinating, thank you. But I don't seem to have any questions in the chat. I can't see any hands up either. Well, you have obviously answered all the questions everybody wanted answering, Victoria. It really was very interesting talk. Does anybody have any comments rather than questions for Victoria? Just so that we know you were listening, so you could, so that we know you could hear. No. Oh yeah, Joanne's got a question. Hi, Joanne. Joanne's another of our stewards. Can you unmute yourself, Joanne, or do we need to do that? Joanne, we can't hear you. I'm seeing if I can. Hey, there she goes.
That better?
That's a lot better, thank you.
Can I just ask Victoria? It is going back to a question rather than an observation. Victoria, thank you so much for a hugely interesting talk. Could I just ask, did the Prebendaries have the right to excommunicate perceived offenders at that time?
I don't know. I think usually it tended to be bishops. Do you know, Chris?
Bishops,
Yes,
or
bishops and archbishops. I mean, there are instances where I think in the 12th century, the Archbishop of York excommunicated most of his chapter, and in retaliation, the Prince Bishop of Durham excommunicated the Archbishop. And eventually they got it all sorted out and started talking to each other. But as I said, it was a tool that was used to, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody had done something absolutely dreadful, which I think we tend to assume you've done something quite beyond the pale.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I can't see anybody else waving at me or raising a hand. I'm just checking through. No. Well, just for me then to thank Victoria for I know a lot of research, a lot of time has gone into preparing the talk, and thank you very much for that. If you don't know where the chapter library is, Victoria can be found up there occasionally. Is it Tuesdays that you're normally there, Victoria?
Yes, on Tuesdays, and by email people can get in touch. And if there's any questions people think of or want to know more about anything, just please get in touch with me. It's library at Southwell.
Minster.org.uk.
Oh, yes, southwellminster.org.uk.
Library at southwellminster.org.uk. No, and I think I'm right in saying you're very happy to take visitors up there by appointment only. That's right.
By appointment, yes, perfectly happy to.
And it's up a Harry Potter-esque little flight of stairs right up there. But it is the most amazing treasure trove of historical books and artifacts and things. And I should also say, if you'd like a tour of the chapter house with one of our stewards, Joanne, who was just asking the question, I know does these tours along with various others of our stewards, then you can also book those through the website or just by contacting the office. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening and supporting these talks. We haven't decided what's going to happen in the spring, but do watch this space. It very much depends on all kinds of factors, not least of which is a little virus that I gather is going around at the minute, as to whether we do some online talks or whether we stick with Zoom. But it's wonderful to know, I know somebody's here, they put it on the chat earlier from quite a long way. I can't remember where Helena's come from now. It was right at the very beginning.
Oxfordshire.
Oxfordshire, and Eve is here in Ireland, and I don't know where the rest of you are from, but it's wonderful to be able to welcome you virtually to Minster. Aoife will be emailing an evaluation form to you. We do read them all, and it helps us plan future sessions, so please do fill those in. And there's one more opportunity, if you haven't already and you'd like to make a donation towards the garden works. But have a lovely Christmas, everybody. Can't believe I'm saying that already. And it would be lovely to see some of you in the new year for some more of the Leaves related activities that we should be doing. So thank you.